Hello everyone, Bronte here. So this evening I'm going to be joining Finn Wright from the 93% Club to talk about his work and education and human rights. So let's see if we can get him on board.
Hello.
Hi Finn, how are you doing?
Not too bad. How are you?
Good, thanks. Sorry
Excellent.
about the wait. Technical
No
difficulties.
worries at all.
The
Always the way with
classic.
tech.
Oh, absolutely. I should be young enough to know how to use these things, but I still don't.
Yeah, no, I'm exactly the same. Do not worry about it.
Okay, great. Well, then let's get straight into it, shall we? I wanted to start by asking you to tell me more about the 93% Club and your role within the charity and
Mhm.
the purpose, what the club is trying to achieve.
Of course, yeah. I guess so. The 93% Club, yeah, is now a charity, but we initially were founded back in 2016 as a university society. By Sophie Pender, who's still involved and still helps us out and still runs the charity with us. But it was kind of started initially as a community to bring kind of students from state educated backgrounds together in the UK. Just as Human Rights Pulse community is quite a global one, state education in the UK are schools funded by the government. They're usually referred to as public schools in other countries, but here public school has a very different meaning. But so it was kind of designed as a community to bring everyone together and kind of overcome kind of a sense of imposter syndrome in British university.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, we've kind of grown exponentially. I helped found the UCL branch about this time last year, and now we're at 47 societies across uh, different UK universities.
That's
Um,
incredible.
yeah, we're really amazed by the growth, and I think the kind of uptake in the kind of membership and interest has really proved that it's a quite a pertinent issue, especially in the UK. And then, kind of since getting charitable status in December, so it's been about 6 months now. We're quite interested in like addressing kind of broader issues that affect state educated students, whether that be kind of material ones or kind of social and cultural ones. So yeah, I guess that's
Mm-hmm.
a very high level summary of what we do.
No, great. And I mean, it is important to make it accessible to an international audience watching
Mhm.
this live video. But one
Yeah.
thing that I can't help thinking immediately when I look at the 93% Club is
Mm.
this is something which is so pertinent to the
Mm.
UK in particular.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are sort of class mobility issues in every
Mhm.
country around the world, but it's particularly entrenched in the UK. Do you agree with me on this point?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's quite strange because the UK is very progressive in a lot of ways. But education seems to be an institution here that moves quite slowly. So, considering, so the name of the 93% Club comes from the fact that 93% of the UK population is kind of state educated. But for
Mm,
example, only 30% of judges in the UK are state educated, only 60% of the cabinet are state educated, and
mhm,
it's those kind of issues that it's kind of this entrenchment that kind of inhibits progress in other areas as well. Not just in the sense of like we don't necessarily call for the abolition of private schools as a charity, but we kind of see it as a you're marginalising quite a lot of voices that need to be heard because they are quite representative of a large group of the
mhm.
largest group of kind of people who have gone through education in the UK.
And also in marginalizing that group, you're really missing out on an enormous pool of talent. You know, if
Mm,
the entire country is being run by 7% of people, they're
yeah.
not necessarily the brightest 7% of people or the most capable or the most skilled. They're, you
Mm,
know, quite often the most privileged, right? That's kind of a
yeah.
prerequisite for most people who are going to a private school is that they come from a certain background. And
Mm.
that kind of excludes an enormous amount of talent which would be coming out of the state education pool.
Mm. Yeah, and I think also we kind of recognize that these issues are also very intersectional ones. So you're not just marginalizing kind of voices of people from, say, lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I mean, a lot of middle class people are also state educated in the UK. So you're kind of marginalising all of those voices, but also voices that have very kind of hybridized experiences of kind of where race and class intersect as well. So you're not just kind of excluding like one voice, you're excluding like a multitude across like a broad spectrum. And I think that's quite problematic. And I think when you ignore these voices, you kind of, I guess the discourse of education gets kind of lowered and kind of homogenized into one experience. It's quite a mind, like one of a minority, I guess.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
We have a couple of comments from AXA here. She's clearly following along with interest. First of all, just saying two OGs of Human Rights Pulse, thanks AXA. And also asking you, what are the main differences between private school and state school students, which make it necessary for the 93% Club to exist? Which is a really great question.
Yeah, I totally, yeah, it is a brilliant one. And one thing we've kind of developed recently is this approach of, we call them the 3 C's of social mobility. So it's kind of economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital. And they're kind of rooted in a lot of sociology in the sense that a lot of them come together. And in the middle is the ability to become socially mobile, because without materials provided by economic capital, which actually state schools kind of lack, I guess an experience we all kind of think about is that when I was at school, we used to share textbooks between 2 people in class, or we would have kind of blurry photocopies of resources, whereas that's not what privately educated people get. And there is obviously a lot of difference within the private education system as well, but that's kind of one factor. And then you're kind of very much taught, you get kind of a broader extra education within private school of kind of how to conduct yourself in kind of interviews, or how to kind of subjects to talk about when you're kind of going for jobs. And that's kind of where we very much operate. We look at kind of what are factors that prevent people from going into certain job markets they want to enter. So those are the kind of
skills.
Yes, exactly. So it's like those soft skills that state schools don't have the time to teach, so people miss out, and actually it then perpetuates that issue of having the same people in the same positions of power and the same kind of platforms to have voices. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And another comment from AXA actually, what about social mobility programs in private schools? For example, scholarships, summer schools for state students in private schools. How is it that, or why do you think it is that these initiatives fail to bridge this gap? And what does the 93% Club have to, like, what role can the 93% Club play in terms of making a difference that these kind of scholarship programs don't?
I think I saw another comment just below as well that was saying that they don't kind of plug the gap a lot. And I think that's kind of very true, because I saw a figure today actually that said like just 1% of people, like 1% of places in private schools are funded by scholarship, and that 1% is kind of like 50, like it's kind of like, that's a ridiculous amount considering they have charitable status as well, which makes them tax exempt. So those issues are a problem. And then I think we kind of plug a gap because we're not necessarily, we're trying to build these networks of people to kind of mitigate against imposter syndrome as well, because going on these programs, you're still going to quite, I guess I'm a planning student, so kind of the physical buildings they're contained within produce this sense of I don't belong here. Whereas we kind of overcome that in different ways of like, we're a very virtual community at the moment, especially during COVID, which I think kind of has enabled us to grow so quickly, but also it kind of allows us to overcome those senses of being an imposter and saying, oh, collectively, no, we deserve to be here and we deserve to have this voice and control over our education.
Absolutely. And then another comment is, how does this issue translate across the world? For example, are there similarities in the US? Obviously, I don't expect you to be an expert on the education sector in foreign jurisdictions, but could be interesting to make this a bit more applicable to other countries.
I think it's definitely applicable elsewhere, because I think, speaking of the United States, I think actually they've got kind of a similar system of university education there is very, very expensive. their public school system, which is the equivalent of our state school system, is very underfunded, under-resourced. I think there it's actually hidden better because it's this idea of the American dream allows that to kind of go, oh, well, you just didn't work hard enough in school, whereas we don't necessarily have this kind of myth of meritocracy here as much. I think on the other side of the spectrum, I've spoken to a few people at university who had an experience in France where they said no one goes to private school because our state schools are so good, no one sees the point in paying for a private education. They tend to be quite religious because obviously the separation of church and state is a lot stronger there. So religious schools you pay to go to. So I think that's quite an interesting perspective. And I think that's one we certainly advocate. We don't, like I said, call for the abolition of private schools, but we call for the better resourcing of state funded institutions that provide education. And I think this experience is possibly translated elsewhere, maybe New Zealand and Australia, because they have quite similar structures. Maybe you can testify to that, but
yeah, I can. We have definitely a parallel in New Zealand, although from a very different sort of context, where we have very, very high quality state schools, and we also have a sort of system of integrated state schools where local pupils who live in the area can go for free, but international pupils or pupils from other areas in the country who might need to board, for example, pay very high sort of international fees, you could say. So this is in secondary schools, right? And I went to one of these schools, a sort of integrated, you could say, integrated state school. Very posh, very old school. We wore, you know, the uniforms with the blazer and the kilt and had all of these very formal traditions. And I had such a strong feeling of imposter syndrome there. Basically, most of the people in school were quite privileged. And for me, coming from a relatively underprivileged background, that was a huge culture shock. So the other problem in New Zealand is we have a system of zoning related to what I was just saying about how local pupils can go to these schools, but pupils from abroad or from far away can't. It's typically zoned within quite a narrow area, and this is especially prevalent in large cities. Like Auckland is the largest city in New Zealand. And you know, if you live in Auckland and you know are thinking about having children, you need to think about which area you're going to buy a house in, because that area is going to determine where your children can go to school. And we have a system called the decile system, where schools are basically not exactly ranked, but kind of categorized based on the wealth, the average wealth, you could say, of the pupils who go to that school. A decile 10 school being the highest amount of wealth in the local area and among the student population, and decile 1 being, you know, basically the whole student population coming from backgrounds of poverty. And so the higher the decile number of your school, basically the better the education you're going to receive. And it does kind of create a bit of there are also private schools as well. But to me, I find this zoning to actually be a bigger problem than the private schools. Because if you really want to send your child to a private school and you can afford it, that's fine, go ahead. As long as there's good quality state education, I have no issue with that whatsoever. As long as everyone's getting a good start in life, if you think that going to a private school is going to add something to your child's life, I mean, sure, go for it. You're not necessarily putting them ahead of the pack if they would have got a good education anyway, right?
Exactly.
But the zoning thing is an issue, because if you can't afford $1 million, multi-million-dollar property, maybe, in the wealthy suburbs of Auckland, then your child isn't getting into the school that would give them the best shot at a future education. And luckily, we don't have really a system of Ivy League universities or sort of an Oxbridge, Russell Group equivalent. All the universities in New Zealand are really great, and they're all, you know, sort of relatively, not exactly easy to get into, but there's not a sense of competition. So I think that goes a certain way towards counteracting it. But then again, there might be a lot of pupils who don't even reach that point where they're applying for universities, because they might have pretty early on in their secondary school career, you know, realized that they were going to be getting a poorly resourced, you know, a poorly funded education, and they might have a large family at home who needs providing for, and they decided that their time would be better spent in a full-time job. You know, a lot of pupils don't make it to the end of secondary schools, particularly pupils in low decile schools. So I would say that that's our version of this issue, and there definitely could be space for something like the 93% Club, even in a
Yeah.
country with a really strong state school system.
Well, some of the stuff you kind of said there really resonates here as well, because we have a similar system of
Mm-hmm.
like catchment areas, of like you fall into a catchment and you'll go to
Mm-hmm.
your local school. And I think it is, like you said, and that feeds into this idea of the economic capital, because actually
Mm-hmm.
wealthy parents can afford to move into a different catchment area, therefore
Yeah.
send their kid to a better school. And I think they're the kind of hidden things of that's not necessarily the school or the state education system, it's the structures that surround these education more generally that
Mm-hmm.
act as like inhibitors. So it's, yeah, it is, and it is interesting because I think it is an issue that transcends so many barriers, and it's an issue of like equity in education. And I think that's what happens around the globe
Mm-hmm.
as well. The issue of education doesn't necessarily get contextualized down to individual countries, because if individual countries have different like problems associated with education, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We have a comment here: grammar schools become havens of the middle class, and it's not about academic performance. Maybe it could be interesting if you could explain a little bit to me grammar schools and how they fit into this system. I have a
Mhm.
bit of an understanding that there's sort of like comprehensive schools, or basically state schools. There's
Mhm.
what in the UK are called public schools, which are
Yeah.
actually private schools, which is very
Yeah.
confusing. And then there's grammar schools, which is
Mm.
something that's a little bit more academically oriented, right? Or
Yeah.
supposed to provide sort of an academic pathway for underprivileged students. Am I correct in saying this?
It's kind of so I kind of going back to my history A level here. It was kind of developed post-war. So we had the system of, they were called grammar schools and secondary moderns back then, and effectively one grammar schools were developed as an academic kind of, they're state schools, so they're state funded still, and but they are kind of more academic orientated, as you said, and they used to act as kind of a funnel to university. So kind of you had to do an exam, the 11 plus, which you still have to do to get into one, and then a lot of students from grammar schools then go on to university. Secondary moderns were then replaced by what are kind of comprehensives, in an effort to kind of initially get rid of this differentiation within the state education system. But they kind of remain today. There's actually 4 in my area, which is very rare to have that amount in one kind of small area. But yeah, they can act as a bit of a funnel um, to kind of university, and they are seen as more academic. But they are equally state funded. So, and there are variations within grammar schools, because some grammar schools used to be private schools that then converted to a grammar school. So some may have endowments from kind of long in British history,
Mm-hmm.
way back when, that allows them to kind of maintain a certain level of kind of material benefit from it. But we kind of, the 93% Club doesn't differentiate between a comp and a grammar school. The issues are different between them, but generally the experience of those two lots of students, is very, very different to those of privately educated students who had a very different experience, all in all.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think grammar schools can act as a funnel to university still, but actually that's also an issue in the UK of like university seen as the, oh, you'll leave school and go to university, whereas for example my career service at school didn't say, oh, there's alternatives. I always wanted to go to university, but some of my friends who decided not to go then didn't get the support, and that feeds again into the lack of resources provided by these schools. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that is one system I can also make a comment on, because at the
Mm,
moment I'm actually living in Germany, and
mm,
they have a completely different system here,
yeah.
where secondary schools are divided into 3 different categories.
Mm,
You have the gymnasium, which is the academic branch of secondary school that you can go to, which is designed to funnel students into university. Then you have
mm,
the Realschule, which is sort of a middle stream for students who would rather go into trades, into like artisanal crafts and so on, of which Germany is really proud. You know, they have amazing craftsmen and amazing kind of like industrial
mm,
production, right? So this is also seen as something which is a really valid career path, as it should be. And then there's a third stream for
yeah.
students who like really struggle in school and really need a lot of extra academic support. And these schools are
Mm,
completely separate to each other. Like they're in different, you know, they're different schools. It's not just like different streams within the same school. This is really different to what we have in New Zealand, and I find this really interesting. I would argue that there's pros and cons. On the plus side, you know, for example, students in the Realschule do get the support they need to go on into an artisanal trade. And, you know, they are encouraged to do like practical internships as part of their studies and so on. It's really like a funnel into the kind of pathway that they want to go into, which I think is amazing. And is therefore, you know, not making them feel sort of bad for not wanting to go on to university, right? Whereas the gymnasium is the school for students who want to continue to university. On the other hand, I do see a bit of an issue with kind of separating people out at such a young age, because if you begin, they begin high school here at 11. So, you know, if you're beginning school at such a young age and then you're only ever interacting with people who are either going to go on to university or not, depending on which school you go to, I think this can create a bit of a problem in terms of almost contributing towards a really rigid class structure as well, almost limiting social mobility and limiting the interaction between people from different backgrounds.
I find it quite interesting, because I think it's kind of how you can, I think there's this real thing about learning from other systems elsewhere and how you can kind of adopt kind of the best aspects, because I think that's where kind of the issue of like discussing like systemic reform and like the reform of education systems comes in, of like, actually there's a real benefit to looking at other systems and seeing what they do well, what they also do badly, so you can kind of figure out kind of the best approach going forward, because that's how you allow people to thrive and actually do what they want to do. Because I think that's the purpose of education, is not to produce like the same person. It is designed to allow an individual to realize whatever their goal in life might be. And people aren't always career driven, so schools like more encouraging artisan kind of craft or those kind of skills are equally as important as an academic institution. So yeah, it's an interesting question, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's a really great way of putting it, that should be the ultimate purpose of an education system, is to help an individual realize their capabilities and their goals rather than following a rigid pathway. And so to bring the conversation a bit broader, since we're here on Human Rights Pulse, I also wanted to ask what human rights mean to you in the context of education, and how you think that the 93% Club relates to human rights in a broader context.
I think, kind of going back to almost earlier, I think human rights is very, especially in education, should be treated differently context to context, because I think the UK, if you went to another country and went, there's issues of kind of separation or degrees of separation within education, how does that enable like equitable access to education? It might not be applicable there. So I think in the UK context, it's maybe a question of equity, and kind of obviously that's quite a big human rights value of having some degree of equality or equity in access to a service. So I think that's the question perhaps here in the UK, of like, is kind of different separation kind of a kind of inhibiting your ability to realize that kind of key tenet of human rights? I think elsewhere human rights is an issue of access. So in some like other countries, vast groups of people are excluded entirely from education. So I think that could be another almost way of viewing it. And I think it is kind of contextualizing it down, and even like within countries, the degree to which you can kind of separate it out. Obviously there's different jurisdictions in the UK. There's different ways of structuring education in the UK, and there's a north-south divide in the UK. So it's questions of that. And I think also access extends to notions of the digital divide now increasingly, because we've seen with COVID that kind of students lack access to the kind of new technological tools required to learn. So I think it's kind of, I guess the way I would reduce it down kind of in summary would be issues of equity and issues of access. And I think those questions change according to different contexts around the globe.
Absolutely. Yeah. This digital divide is particularly pertinent, especially as we kind of move forward into a post-COVID world and all of the digitalization and home office and homeschooling that entails.
Yeah.
That's something that is also a huge issue in New Zealand because, like I mentioned, we have these lower decile schools, which, you know, they still receive like state funding, but just simply because the, you know, the students attending the schools are coming from poor backgrounds, their families are not able to make as substantial donations to the school as richer schools, right? And so they are just simply still poorly resourced. And, you know, now there's sort of a policy of bring your own device to school. That's been that way for quite a few years. It came in my last couple of years of school about 5 years ago. And now, you know, all students are expected to bring in a laptop or an iPad or something so that they can work digitally in school. Great policy in terms of, you know, pushing forward the digitalization of the country and computer literacy and all these sorts of things, really well-meaning. But in reality, how can you expect people from low-income households to have an iPad or a laptop of their own that they can bring to school? And the schools are then supposed to provide laptops or iPads for students who can't bring them themselves. But if you're going to a school which is equally underprivileged and equally poor as your own family background, how many laptops are there really going to be to go around?
Yeah, I think I saw a comment from Jamie a little bit further up about how we did some research kind of recently, which was really interesting on kind of the home working environment from home during COVID for students. So when university students had to go back home, how sharing bedrooms, sharing laptops with siblings, all kind of contribute to kind of the perpetuation of like division and kind of this lack of equity and access. And I think it is those questions of like, how do you make sure that the schools who are catering to kind of students who lack economic or kind of material resources, how do you plug those gaps? Because like you said, students shouldn't have to necessarily go from sharing a textbook to sharing a laptop in class. Like that's not how it should be structured. And I think that's also a human rights question of like, actually that kind of issue should be prioritized within agendas because they are the ones that actually have the most kind of tangible impact on someone, I think.
Absolutely. And again, to kind of loop back to a point you made earlier, there was a comment earlier when I was talking about this decile system and the zoning system in New Zealand. There was a comment along the lines of, so a form of segregation in all but name. And I immediately thought, yes, that's exactly what it is. It is a form of segregation in all but name, a largely unintentional one. The system is not designed that way, but it's the reality of it, and it becomes very much an intersectional issue. Just like you said earlier, it's you know, the people who are going to state schools in the UK are not just representing one group of the population, but many different marginalized groups, kind of with this intersectionality of socioeconomic class and race, religion, all kinds of things. It's very much the same in New Zealand, where the people going to higher decile schools are more predominantly Pakeha, which is a white European descent New Zealander like myself, and often the lower decile schools have a much higher proportion of Maori, Indigenous students and Pacific Islander background students. So it very much becomes an intersectional issue, and almost one could go so far to say as a race issue.
Yeah,
and there's a comment here just affirming exactly what I'm saying, that a form of segregation that will disproportionately affect people of colour in major cities, which is exactly the case, because of course there are areas of a city which have a higher proportion of people from a certain ethnicity or a certain religious background because they band together in communities, and then those schools accordingly are not sufficiently resourced.
I think it is a question of, as well, like you were saying, about the segregation's not always intentional. It's actually sometimes it's actually an unwillingness to change sometimes, an unwillingness to look at it and go, actually, this isn't fit anymore for purpose. And actually you need to, like you say, look around and look what's good, look at the digital divide and realize that digital literacy is a major issue that if you go on addressing it, will have major consequences for the individuals, but also broader questions for the economy and other things down the line. And it is that, like you were saying, an unwillingness to also contextualize within cities. London in the UK is a massive example. I saw New York mentioned, but other cities around the world are major ones as well. Tokyo, for example, is a huge city containing millions and millions of people. That's productive heart of a country, if you don't address these issues of segregation or separation in education, you're not going to move forward in every other aspect of life.
Actually, something that I've recently heard brought up in this context of education and social mobility and human rights is student towns and the role that they can play in a very positive sense. Because a lot of cities, like London, for example, like you mentioned, Tokyo, New York, Auckland, and New Zealand, completely unaffordable to live in. Unless your family lives in the city, you know, you have to be from a pretty well-off background and be getting some family help to afford the rent there, even with a student loan, even with a job. So these kind of smaller, more affordable student towns with really good quality universities can be a really important tool in terms of helping to uplift the social mobility, because we can't ignore the fact that university education, it's a complicated issue. It's not only about getting into the right universities and having the soft skills, like you mentioned, of being able to, you know, being able to network, feeling comfortable in an interview, feeling comfortable in certain physical environments, but it's also about the funding, right? The funding for your fees and the funding for your living costs, which is an entire, we could have an entire discussion just about that, I think.
Yeah, we could. That's a major one here, and I'm sure everywhere else as well. Yeah, it's just, it's kind of mad. And it is mad how education is often seen as a peripheral, say in government policy, even departments of education aren't considered major, like they are considered important, but they're not up there with foreign policy, defence, those kind of issues. So to what extent does that reflect a human rights issue in itself, that often these, even within governments, they are not prioritised as a really, really important, if not the most important kind of feature of government policy or funds and things like that. So it's a fascinating question, I think.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're educating the next generation. Those are going to be your leaders in 20 years, you know, your leaders in business and politics and on the world stage. I mean, it's so clear that the education of a population is kind of a fundamental part of creating the kind of society that we want to see, right?
Yeah, it totally is. And I think that's also feeding into human rights issues. It's not necessarily that education as a human rights issue, it's education is empowering people to address other issues within the sphere. Human rights often gets used as a really quite nebulous label, but a lot of issues in human rights could be solved by robust education, even if it's increasing understanding, but also just increasing an individual's ability to kind of, I guess, not even having that other one extra barrier in front of you of a lack of education that means you can kind of overcome the next one that you're going to inevitably, unfortunately, face sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also makes me think of kind of, again, the importance of diversity of voices and powerful positions, because someone who comes from a certain background, you know, typically, at least in a country like the UK, sort of typically white, you know, very wealthy, went to a private school, they might not have an understanding of the same kinds of issues that other kinds of people in the UK would face, who come from a very different background and who come from a less, you know, a less privileged background. If we have more of this diversity of voices being seen in higher education and therefore going on to become leaders in their respective fields, then immediately you're going to be presented with more diverse solutions to the problems that certain sectors of the population face, which sort of the ruling elite might not even recognize as problems. Again, not through any like malignant intent, but through just their own lack of experience with these issues.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's so important to, I think also just a good education system teaches you that you learn throughout your life as well. So it teaches people to go, oh, as I grow older, knowledge will evolve with me, and like understand that you're not just a student in school, but beyond it. And I think that's what schools should kind of foster as well, that appreciation of kind of, oh, this is kind of like this ability to be aspirational about learning and be enthusiastic going forward about, you know, the ability to kind of just accumulate knowledge and become like understanding of more people or more ideas or more the positive changes that we want to see. I think it is, can't be understated often.
Something which has been a big topic in New Zealand, sort of in the last, I don't know, 5, 10 years, has been civics education. And there's been a big sort of youth movement
Mm,
pushing for civics education in schools, because it's just seen as
mm,
being such an invaluable tool. And when I say civics education, I mean, sort of teaching students a bit more than we're currently taught about how the political system works, how the legal system works, about your
mm,
responsibilities as a citizen and your rights as a citizen, and kind of equipping students with these tools to engage
mm.
in a more socially responsible way, I suppose you could
Yeah.
say. I don't know whether that's also something of interest to the 93% Club, or
I,
whether it comes into contact with your work, but I think it's a really interesting concept.
I think it does. I don't think we focus on it as much at the moment. I mean, because we're quite new still. But I think those kind of questions are quite important ones, because one thing actually that it kind of links to in some ways is that we don't necessarily exclude privately educated students from joining our clubs, because we kind of see it as a bit of a, in some ways, a backward step, because actually a lot of people who are looking to join the 93% Club as a privately educated person is because they've got the kind of ability to look forward and understand that actually
Mm-hmm.
they had really good education that other people didn't access, and why is that? What can they do in the future to perhaps use what they've the advantage they've got to kind of apply and help others? And I think it's those conversations about being quite candid with people and going, actually, this isn't an issue that's a divisive one. It's an issue of
Mm-hmm.
actually, just like I've said before, equity, and actually everyone should have the quality, the private education quality that you see in some places, because it's an enriching one, and one that so many people would benefit from. So I think it is those issues of kind of, in a sense, engaging with it as a community issue, as a civic issue, because it encourages it to become just kind of a norm rather than a divisive issue,
Mm-hmm.
which often happens in human rights as well. Of like, people quickly go, "Oh, this issue's too divisive," and actually stops kind of the ability to productively change something or move in a positive direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, couldn't
Mm,
couldn't agree more. Just generally speaking, I personally am a huge supporter of kind of welcoming people into activist spaces, even if they are
mm,
people who, like in this context, who have benefited from the sort of privilege that allowed them to have a better education. Like, they should be equally
mm,
welcome in the space, because it's not their fault that they were
mm,
that they come from a privileged background, any more than it's the
mm,
fault of someone who comes from an underprivileged background.
mm,
We don't get to choose our circumstances, and all you can do is recognize the privilege that you have,
mm,
recognize the privilege that you don't have, and then go forward and try to, make a positive difference in the world with whatever you've been given.
mm. Yeah.
Question here from AXA. Do you
Hmm.
find there is a different appetite to teach things like civic education, even trying to decolonialize the curriculum, differing between state schools and private schools? Very good question.
I guess it's an interesting one, because I think it does go back to that sense of tradition, in that sense of like, these are quite progressive ideas, in the sense of integrating them into the curriculum are often seen as quite radical, but actually they're not really.
Mm-hmm.
It's an issue of decolonizing the curriculum is equivalent to, in some ways, looking at division in within education, because actually decolonize by having a kind of a decolonized curriculum, you're having a more equitable curriculum, in the sense that it caters to everyone, it understands other points of views of things, and it also acknowledges that there is a sense of justice. And I think that's what comes into it. It's social mobility is a social justice question, as is decolonizing the curriculum. It's a question of like, it's a question of different justice, but it's a question of justice in itself, I think. And I think that's, they
Mm-hmm.
are very interrelated, if they're not, despite being distinct in having different people pushing for them sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm,
Absolutely. Something I can
yeah.
share that's a bit of a positive piece of news. I think in the human
Mm,
rights sector, we're being bombarded a lot with, very negative news.
yeah.
But something really positive that recently happened in New Zealand is that a bill has been passed requiring all law schools to teach traditional Maori, like
All
teaching
right.
tikanga Maori is what we would say, which is kind of like
Mm,
Maori principles and Maori worldview. So basically,
Yeah,
an Indigenous perspective is now compulsory in all law studies, which
that
I
is.
thought was really amazing. I think a lot of law schools were already kind of moving in that direction,
Mm,
and it was already pretty normal to have this perspective included as part of your studies. But to make it compulsory is such a positive step.
yeah,
And really shows like the kind of thing that can be achieved. And like you say, it's not particularly radical. It's actually pretty practical. It
yeah,
makes a lot of
yeah,
sense when you think about it.
yeah.
Really, it's not a it's not a no, it's not a really crazy idea.
Yeah, I've had discussions within the Human Rights Pulse community before of actually, I'm a very firm believer in actually a lot of just being a bit more practical about approaching an issue can be so fruitful in actually delivering what are very good results. I think sometimes, especially say issues of decolonizing the curriculum, of providing equity in education are ones that are seen as very big and hard to deal with, but actually they're not if you break them down into quite small things of just going, oh, actually, in New Zealand, for example, we need to understand a certain
Mm-hmm.
the view of Indigenous people because their view is just as valid as ours,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of it's a very small thing and quite specific thing that you can intervene and change that will actually have a very positive long-term impact that allows for lays the foundation for broader change.
Mm-hmm. And it's really
Yeah.
a very practical thing to implement because in our
Mm,
court system, there's a lot of issues arising in terms of, for example, Maori land claims still,
mm,
or like, for example, a few years ago, there was a river in New Zealand that was, it was given sort of the legal right to exist as an entity. The river has basically been created as a legal person.
yeah,
This kind of precedent, which is set, is very often based on an Indigenous perspective. It's already integrated into our legal system
yeah,
because it's already integrated. Māori perspectives are already just so firmly like integrated into New Zealand culture. So
mm,
having this in law school, it's not a crazy left wing idea. It's practical.
yeah,
Law students do need to have this knowledge if they're going to go out into the New Zealand court system and like succeed as lawyers in these kind of cases.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
sometimes I really agree that these kind of issues can be seen as divisive or politically partisan in a way which they
Mm.
just really shouldn't be.
Yeah, and it's often an issue of framing it in a linguistic sense as well, because say
Mm,
what we found is social mobility for some on the political spectrum is an issue of social justice, but for some it's also an issue of meritocracy and the ability
mhm,
to pursue your dreams and goals, which are very
mhm,
different ideas of social mobility. But collectively, if you work together to realize that vision, you're going to get an idea that actually settles both sides of the argument quite
yeah,
easily. So
you
it's
can really
kind
have
of
like a very neoliberal perspective and very individualistic perspective, and then a
mm,
very communal or communalistic perspective, I would say,
yeah,
in terms of this education issue. So, like you
yeah,
say, it can also be about the individual achieving their aims, which is something a bit more closely associated with the right, or
yeah,
social justice, which is a bit more associated with the left.
yeah. So it is one of those things of I think that's also a valuable way of framing things because you do have to ultimately collaborate to push for what is just a basic human rights issue quite often, and
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't always necessarily matter the way it's settled, but the way you it can produce kind of knock-on effects as well because it can produce more collaboration later on that it just kind of has a domino effect sometimes, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's also something I love about human rights and
Mm,
framing issues in terms of human rights is that it keeps it relatively um, politically bipartisan or non-partisan,
mm,
and kind of
yeah,
identifies these issues that we can all get behind, no matter one's political views or sort of party affiliation.
exactly. Because it makes the ones that are divisive along those lines more constructive in having that debate that is often required. So it's just a matter of channeling energy sometimes. Fight the battles that need to be fought ideologically, I guess, but then don't fight the ones that are needlessly framed as a left or right or a centrist issue. They are
Mm-hmm.
ones that transcend so many barriers, and I think that's a very applicable thing to human rights in general, as you I'm sure agree.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's a really insightful comment. One last question for you before
Mhm.
we sort of wrap up. In your opinion, how can the UK work towards positive systemic change,
Mhm.
which upholds the universal right to education?
I think it is an issue of providing equal access, and I think it's actually an issue of it can be as basic as better funding for schools.
Mm-hmm.
That's um, especially with COVID spending, quite seen as quite a good way of thinking about things, of kind of understanding that actually if you funnel the money in the right places, it can help a lot. I know that's quite a strange comment, because I think a lot of human rights issues are also not solved by money. But I think that's a good first step, and then that allows you to have discussions about issues, broader issues later on. And I think also that issue is settled by sometimes charities of having kind of providing a bit of extra funding to schools and opportunities where the government doesn't. But I think it is just an issue of funding quite often, and just providing those resources that allow you to access more equal forms of education. So I think, yeah, it's a bit of a dry, boring response to that, but I think that's the practical, non-political way of thinking about it.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time this evening. It was a really, really
Anytime.
interesting discussion, really interesting
Yeah.
to hear about your work,
Oh,
and to kind of contextualize these issues and how they arise in different countries.
oh,
Seems
thank
like,
you.
across the board, as you pointed out, there are issues in terms of access to education and equity in education, but it is so context dependent in terms of how it kind of arises or materializes. So yeah, it's been really great hearing sort of more of a UK perspective on this one.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, it was a really good discussion. Shame we didn't have longer, because it is a very deep issue, but it's an important one. I think it's great that we've sat down and had a chat about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much to everyone who joined us in this live session, and for all of the
Yes.
comments and engagement.
Mm.
Seems like the audience were really passionate about this issue, which is great to know.
Yeah. It's quite a relief, and it's yeah, great for future cooperation. So yeah.
Absolutely. And a little plug for the 93% Club. To everyone who's watching, you can go and check them out on Instagram, on their website, at the 93% Club. So
Thank you.
thanks very much to everyone for joining us, and thanks, Finn.
Yeah. See you soon. See you later.
See you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.